Today, we're going to talk with Marcee about neurodiversity. One of the reasons we brought Marcee on, we just saw her in the classroom and with kids who have neurodiversity, and we just loved her philosophy that these children were gifted, and she just had a magic with them. She was so good with them. And so we brought her on because we just feel like she is our expert of neurodiversity and neurodiverse students and just how amazing they are. So we brought her on to ask her a couple questions. Welcome, Marcee.
Thank you. Glad to be here. One of the best experiences of my life is working with Knox, using this methodology. It's just completely changed my kids' lives and our whole family. It's just become a way of life. We love it.
We wanted to ask you, Marcee, because you are just such an expert in this field, in our opinion. And so we wanted to ask you a couple questions about this. And let's start with the first one. What is neurodiversity, and then what does it have to do with education anyway?
Okay, so neurodiversity isn't just a buzzword or being politically correct. It's actually something that was named in like the 1990s by this Australian sociologist who's also autistic herself, to try to describe ways that the brain works differently in a way that wasn't pejorative. So to focus on ability instead of disability. So when you say neurodiversity, most people think you're just talking about autism. And that affects, well, it depends on who you talk to and what the statistics are. But CDC says about 3% of boys right now are autistic. But that's not the only piece that we're talking about. And the reason I say that it's not just political correctness is because the research now being done is actually doing MRIs and brain scans of kids at rest and kids doing tasks and looking at how the brain lights up differently for neurodiverse kids. So as well as autism, there's also dyslexia, dyspraxia, and ADHD, and others probably as well. But if you lump all that in there, depending on who you ask, the UK says that's probably 30 to 40% of kids are fit that mold. US is more like 1 in 4. So it's a pretty high part of our population. And in public schools anyway, usually you only hear about the kids that are really, need a lot of help. And then those kids get 504s and IEPs, and they're pulled out, and there's all this different ways of dealing with their neurodiverse ways of learning in that situation. So it has everything to do with education. How your brain works has everything to do with education. So
it's how you
learn, it's how you process, how you organize the world, how you understand, empathy, all of those things are all rolled in.
So this really plays into kind of the Knox way of teaching, which is that we really look holistically at the kid and the world itself to try to say what learning actually is and how best we can attack this. And for the neurodiverse kid, we often just consider this a asset, that neurodiversity is kind of the way that we want to go about learning, because neurodiverse kids actually think about things in a different way. And neurodiversity, there's a whole spectrum, like you said, right? So and I guess as the second question, as a follow-up to that, could you dive just a little bit deeper into what you think is happening in the public education system with neurodiverse kids? Like, what are they doing to try to address neurodiversity, and why that might be, a little deficient?
Yeah, so a mentor of both of ours once talked about the public system as a huge boat, right? That takes a really long time to turn. And I saw this when I did a few classes in grad school in the education field. And one of my good friends was a PhD in education. And she would talk about all the time how frustrated she was, where the things they're doing, the research they're doing at the universities isn't getting translated down to teacher training, isn't making changes in actual public school systems. And so it's not that teachers and administrators don't know this, they know this, but getting to implement the changes has been an uphill battle. So I want to say that first, because there are so many great educators out there that are really trying to implement this stuff. Part of one of the things that they are doing to try to help education has to do with this principle of universal design for learning. And this is just exactly what we do. We didn't even know that's what it was called when we started doing it. And I'll get into that in a little bit, but I want to talk about what the system, the traditional system, does right now. And that comes down to, you know, some of the things that are just bastions and foundations of public education. Scope and sequence, this idea that kids have to learn things in an order, and they have to learn a certain amount of things or they're not being educated. And then also testing, that we have to somehow evaluate where they're at. And anytime you start testing and doing style of evaluation, now you're comparing kids, and now you're drawing a line saying these kids are adequate, these kids below are not adequate. And that causes structural upstream things that just are going to happen in your system if that's what's going on. And so to make sure these kids are not falling behind, then they need more, right? And so depending on what the kid's diagnosis is or what their particular neurodiversity is, that could mean a 504 or an IEP where the teacher is required. And it doesn't always happen, like even though a parent will go to all this length to get an IEP, and then teacher just can't, or doesn't have time, or doesn't have resources to implement these things. Or they pull them out and they'll put them in a special education situation. Or in the case of gifted 2E kids, which means kids that are intellectually, their IQ is higher, or not just IQ, there's gifted is a whole thing that we could spend, you know, an hour talking about. This idea that half of kids that test gifted also have, we call it twice exceptional. They also have some kind of learning issue, where that's neurodiversity or a learning disability, a classified learning disability. Half of kids that are super smart or super good at one of the 5 different areas also have this other piece that comes with it. So, you know, and the teachers assume that if they're gifted, you can figure it out. Here's the material, figure it out. And that's just not how it works. It's not all teachers assume this, but you know, the general population assumes, well, they're smart. Why aren't they doing better? And it's because it's not just all about academics. It's not all about smarts. It's about a lot of things. And it all comes down to this neurodiversity. So they're asked to learn material in a very rigid or specific type of way. They're asked to receive the information, process information, and be evaluated on the information in a very neurotypical way. Because this works for neurotypical kids. There's, you know, well, it works. It works better for neurotypical kids. And so they're in this system that just doesn't mesh with how their brain works. And so we either throw extra work at them, we pull them out, we try to make accommodations that sometimes, you know, with a lot of irregularity can get implemented or not. And it can be a really frustrating situation to be in for a parent as well as for the student. And my biggest concern with neurodiverse kids in a public system, and again, it depends on your teacher. My niece, who's the same age as my second daughter, is gifted 2E, and her teacher last year was amazing. She was so good for her. She just did, it was brilliant. It was just brilliant. But that's not the case 100% of the time, 80% of the time, 50% of the time. That's 10% of the time, 10 to 20 maybe, right? Like it's that 1 or 2 teachers in elementary school that they don't have this negative experience. And what the negative experience is that they're dumb, they are distracted, they're lazy, they're, what are some other ones that come up?
Well, just that they're different, right?
Yeah.
Because once you separate somebody and say that now you're different from the even just the average, right? Then all of a sudden it really plays with the kid's mind. Even though we're telling them that you're the same, they see themselves as different. We know, our own daughter was in one of the gifted programs for a couple of years, and
whatever that means. They tested in kindergarten. How do you know?
And all the problems that come along with that. But that she was in it for a while, and she often talks about how the gifted kids at the school were often
they were set aside, so
we
they were
use the word bullied,
bullied,
but they were, because they knew that those kids were gifted, and because they knew that they were gifted, then they were different. And it's really just the difference that
they've been given a label. And that's one thing too, is just it's just like you said, it's so ingrained, like it's just so hard to overcome those old ideas that there's something wrong, that this is a disability. This is this is 30 years since this, you know, since these changes have been going, but still, it's just, it's still so ingrained that, yeah, if you're different, there's something wrong, you know, and then some of these ideas is that there's something wrong with you. And it's so hard to like get away from that.
You know, it's kind of this part of like human brains. We want to be normal. We want to have our people. We want to fit in. And I think one of the things that education does, because of the testing, because of the benchmarks and all of that, we kind of dig into that even harder than we need to. And so this message of you've got to be normal, you've got to fit in is so, so important. And when you've got 30 to 40% of the population, or 25 or whatever it is, that don't fit in, that's a lot of kids. That's a lot of kids. And we've got to figure out a way to make a universal system, you know, something that works for everybody all together.
Yeah. So this actually,
we figured out at Knox. I'm talking about the rest of them. They've got to
figure it out. Marcee, I think that's the perfect segue to, well, then what is Knox trying to do to address neurodiversity? You know, what we often, we like the term Noxi, like what is the Noxi way of addressing neurodiversity?
Right. So a lot of ways. And I mentioned that universal design for learning that's already in the laws earlier, that is essentially what we do. So the biggest, there's kind of three pieces, right? It's giving information in more than one format, right? So we don't stand up and lecture. We don't give them an article to read. That's not the only way that we give them. We are always giving them a diverse way of taking in information, okay? Whether that's a video from YouTube that's clever or funny, whether that's a guest speaker, whether that's through a simulation, whether that's through a game. Games can be really great ways of taking in information. And we just run the gamut. We just try to do whatever we can think of that's not just a lecture. And we do a little bit of that. Like, it's not that lecturing is bad, but it's if we're always just doing the same style of learning, you're only going to get those narrow bit of kids that really get that. And the rest are going to check out. They're going to check out. So it's, you know, communicating information in a variety of ways. And then it's giving them a variety of ways to interact with material. And so we do this a lot with projects. And a huge piece for neurodiverse kids is agency. Anything you read, they have got to be involved in what they're studying. They've got to be involved in how they're studying it and how they're being evaluated. They just do, or they just shut off. And I don't know how much of that is socialized or how much of how that brain works, but it's just a fact. And so they need to have some skin in the game deciding how they're going to interact with this material. Are they going to make a video about a book they read? Are they going to build something about this place that they're studying, whether it's a diorama or a model of some kind, or whatever it's going to be, right? A poster. Are they more visual? Are they going to do a dance about this thing or some kind of performance? We have found at Knox, kids love to perform. They love it. They eat it. They live it. They breathe it. Every term has someone's doing a performance, if not more than one. Do they write about things? Do they just like to talk to their neighbors? Do they prefer more solitary work or more collaborative work, or solitary for a piece? And then, you know, and so giving them the freedom to engage with the material and with their peers, what feels comfortable and safe for them is really, really important. It's just foundational. And then the last thing is helping them, like offering multiple ways to motivate and encourage them. And so in a public system, this is grades. We obviously don't grade, right? We try to find other ways to help them reflect on how things are going with them. We talk about it a lot as a class, like, okay, who showed grit in this experience? And what made you really stick with this project when you worked on it for 4 hours one day and 4 hours the next, and then the whole thing just crumbled because it got knocked off and fell to pieces? Why did you start over, or why didn't you, right? And so having these conversations about how they're learning and how they're working and what is lighting them up and what is shutting them off is all really, really important. I was thinking of another example because you told me to share some examples of students. There's one student in particular that's near and dear to my heart, sweetest thing in the world. And I had her when she was 9-ish, 9, 10. And then I've worked with her a little bit on and off since in different contexts. And I've worked with other members of her family. And she, they didn't have a diagnosis actually until just recently. So I was just talking to her mom about some things they discovered about this child. And she would come up to me a lot in class, and she needed to talk to me a lot and ask a lot of questions. And you'll find that's actually pretty typical with neuroatypical kids, is they need, well, what about this? Or I need this, and their brains, they need certain types of support. And come to find out, she has some learning disabilities that totally explain some things that her parents were trying to figure out, as well as ADHD. And that one, they were like, what? How does that even? Because she was just a very soft, like, you know, not in your face, right, kind of chick. And she struggled with a lot of different things, but she would always try. I've never met a harder worker in my life. And this ability to hyper focus, we were working on a project, we were studying the Vikings, and I saw this little pattern for making Viking shoes. So I showed him the pattern. I didn't like have him copy or anything. It's okay, measure your foot. Let's see if we can figure out how this pattern would go together. So, and I do this a lot in my teaching with my students and with my children, is I don't always tell them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I mean, there's times when that's important, but if I show them where they need to go, and I talk through some of the challenges, and I say, okay, how can we figure this out? That's another way that you invite neurodiverse kids in, because they talk about divergent thinkers and different imaginations, and they come at things in ways that just blow your mind. Multiple of them in any given project, right? Like I'm like, whoa, I never thought of that. And it's so fun as a teacher to like see, oh yeah, we could totally do it that way. And so you open it up. And so she was kind of quiet, but she was looking at it and thinking through it. And a lot of the kids blew through it. Some of them spent a little bit longer. Some gave up kind of quickly and moved on to something else, which is totally fine, right? You need to let them get to the activity, the project that they're excited about. And she just slowly and methodically was watching what other people were doing, trying something else. She spent, what was it, like 2 weeks of recesses plus class time making these Viking turn shoes out of felt and just stitching them. And she sat next to me during lunch and says, can you thread my needle? And I thread her needle. Can you thread it again? And I just threaded her net probably 200 times. And she just kept working on it. And she finished these shoes. And her classmates were so impressed, just like, wow, look at her shoes. And it was like this symbol of so many things, of like ingenuity and creative thinking and grit and sticking to it and trying and trying and trying and excellence, right? Like she really wanted to get the stitches just right. We talk about the number of lessons she learned there and the amount of self-esteem and confidence she got from doing it, but then also from her classmates and inspiring others as well. And I just want to mention, so, you know, neurodiversity, the whole point of the term is to acknowledge that differences exist, that they're not deficits, but then reframe these challenges as strengths. Yes. And recognize the weaknesses, of course, but not as something wrong and bad about this child. Everyone has strengths and weaknesses. So there's this really cool chart, and maybe I'll send it to you and you can like stick it in there because it's really cool. Yeah. But what it has is it has kind of the 4 main neurodiversities. And on one side is, you know, how they often get viewed in society, in the public school system. So like, for example, ADHD, right? Impulsive, temper outbursts, hyperactivity, low frustration threshold, easily distracted or over-focused, lack of inhibitions. That's classic ADHD. We just think that they've got a lot of energy. No, it's all these other pieces. But then if that's what you're focusing on, that's what you'll get, right? What you plant, what you water, what you notice, that's what you get. So instead, like, who wants a kid like this? Quick-witted, intuitive, creative, energetic, ability to hyper-focus and get cool things done. Empathetic, good talker, gregarious. Those are your ADHD kids. It's both. It's both. Yeah. And that's exactly what I saw at Knox as well, because we normalize difference. We said everybody's different and we celebrate everybody's strengths. We get to celebrate neurodiverse kids as well, their strengths, and they become their strengths, not their weaknesses, right? And then amazing things happen when you focus on those strengths.
Yeah. And I think the key was that environment that you developed where they were seen as strengths and they were focused on as strengths. And it's what do you choose? And really, like, if you choose to see the negative, then you're right. That's actually what will manifest itself even more out of those children. But if you choose to focus and celebrate those strengths and encourage those strengths, then that's what's manifested even more.
Great book called The Strengths Finder, and based on a bunch of research, and they talk about it's actually much more effective to focus on your strengths and making those very strong than trying to fix your weaknesses, which is exact opposite of what we think. And this was not written for neurodiversity. This was just some research and people were doing a business. And this has kind of become my big like focus in homeschool and at Knox is, all right, your strengths. Make sure the kids are challenged in their strengths and then everything else kind of settles down, right? And
Love
there
it.
are times when you do have to focus on a weakness here and there, right? Like time blindness is a thing that you kind of have to like walk them through and help them through. You can't just ignore it. It just doesn't go away. But the first step is really to focus on those strengths, make sure they're being challenged in those strengths, and then all kinds of self-esteem and positive hormones are happening in the brain, and it makes them more able to address those things that are challenging for them. I'm thinking of a
I love
specific
that
example.
phrase. Challenge them in their strengths.
Mhm. Yep.
I love that phrase. I think that
Well,
that
that
needs to be
focus.
quilted on every pillow.
And that focus, I know, like just recently I saw in a conversation you were mentioned with that, where it's so easy as parents to be like, oh, but you see their weaknesses as parents.
Mhm.
And it's so hard not to focus on those. But if you can, as a parent, focus on those strengths,
Mhm.
like you said, then the weaknesses are pulled up with it. Can we switch now to a little bit to like, okay, what about in the home? Because a lot of parents I know, when they see maybe that their children aren't excelling in a traditional school, and so they pull out their children, but then now it's on them, and so they're
Mhm.
wondering, okay, how can I help maybe my neurodiverse child? What if I have multiple neurodiverse children? What about if I just have one and then I have children who maybe like do excel in this other way? How do I do this at home with my children? And I think these philosophies are awesome for changing the paradigm. But like, do you have any, like, actually, I know you have so many tips because I've heard a lot of them already that are such great tips, not only for families with neurodiverse, but for all families, but for sure, like with neurodiverse children. Do you have any tips?
Well, so we talk a lot about learning styles, and most people have heard that term, and they think of the three main ones: kinesthetic, oral, and visual. There's at least 7. And it's they're even more nuanced than that, right? And so I think the first big piece of advice I'd give to anybody that's homeschooling, with any kind of kid that just doesn't quite get the mold or even does, is really key in to how do they learn. What, like we joke about one of my daughters, all of my kids started decoding words at the same time, right? Some of them just like sucked in and focused on it and did it, and some of them were distracted and wanted to do the things. Like one of my daughters, we always talk about how she was too busy dancing and running and kicking to sit down to take the time to learn how to read, right? Even though she was capable at a very early age. And so letting them, like, figuring out what makes them tick, what they love, how they learn, and what approaches are going to light them up, right? And just notice, try something. If it fails, great, you learned something. You learned that, gosh, making them do copy work is going to make them cry. And you have to decide if that's the thing that you're going to push right now, or you're going to focus on something else. Let it go and try it later,
let it
right?
go.
When they're more
Don't hold
ready.
on, let it go.
Lots of letting go. I think we all have to go through this this period of where we relearn what learning is, what education is, and understanding that what happens at school is different than what happens at home by necessity. You know your kids so well, and you have the opportunity to know them even more when you have them home with you all day and you're trying to teach them and learn with them, right? So that would be the first thing, is really get to know your kid, their strengths and their weaknesses, but more their strengths, how they light up, what makes them tick, and then bring them into the conversation. Say, well, how do you want to learn about the Caribbean, or how do you want to approach learning math? And let them try out different things. Like, I know doing the research for curriculum is so exhausting. And a lot of the time it's just a waste, right? Like, anyway, and so it can be a really frustrating experience to go through. But if you know that your kid does really well, like if screens and like videos or cartoons light them up, they're a storyteller, they're very visual. Find ways to connect with them on those subjects that you need to work on in those ways. But yeah, bring them in and ask them, say, so what did you think of Autistic Academy? I have one child that is very sensitive to things that are babyish or that talk down to you at all. And she always has been, like, since she could talk, which was like at 18 months. Well, it was earlier than that, but anyway, right? Like, don't talk down to me, she says, as she's 2. So there's just certain things that she won't touch because they talk down to her. She wouldn't watch other videos my kids loved because it was too babyish.
Yeah.
And so just kind of knowing those things, asking what they think, what they want to try, having them help set goals, and also say, okay, well, what would we consider progress, right? Is it a time thing? Are you going to work on this for 15 minutes every day? sometimes that's great. Sometimes that's the skill they need to work on, is doing something consistently for a certain amount of time, and that's good enough. Sometimes it's, well, I want to see you challenge yourself in this area. So are you going to, like, if your child's a writer, I've got one of those. Are you going to write more pages? Are you going to do more revising? Are you going to try a different genre, right? And so helping them figure out how to challenge themselves and how to mark success is another really important thing for figuring out how to do this on your own with your kiddos.
In a Noxi education, what we're trying to do is we're helping them to feel that they feel a bit more responsible for their education. And when they participate, when they follow their passions, when they even mark their own progress, and then even talk, and usually in a very mature kind of a way, because it requires maturity, that it really helps them to feel like, oh, education is mine. It's not somebody else's. Education is the thing that I'm responsible for. And obviously with the mentorship of parents and with others in the community, but that they take the lion's share even of the responsibility of it, but also the lion's share of the fun, right? the great benefits of education, you know, the all of those things they get as well.
And I love that, because that answers so many people's questions of, okay, how do I do this? And the answer is, you don't do it any differently for any of your children. You educate your whole family this way, and it works for all of them. And I love that, because we are all actually very neurodiverse, right? We're all, and there are ones who fit in that category specifically of certain, they learn that certain way, but really neurodiversity to me means, you know, even more than that, like we all just learn in a different way. But
which makes the circle, it's actually making the circle just a little bit bigger than
making it universal, right?
We all thrive. We all thrive by learning this way. They're just kind of the signalers that we need to change things up. This isn't working, and really there's a lot of us in the background saying, well, actually, like, maybe I am not showing so many signs, but it didn't work for me either. Do you know what I mean? So
well, and you know, like, we all figure out coping mechanisms too, right? Like, I did very well in public school, to my detriment, to be honest. Like, it became the way that I marked my self-esteem. I marked my worth and my value. I did dumb things like pull all-nighters all the time to get, because I had to have at least a 94 on everything, right? Like, it was, it really played in to some mental weaknesses.
Right.
And we often say, like, Marcee, we often say, like, one of the things it did for me is it really made me good at cheating. I was like the best cheater out there, because I wanted to get the best grade. I was so competitive with my grades that, and it does something different for every one of us, especially those kids who can't. They're not the 10% that are able to function in this hyper pressured system. They can't do that very well, and so they're actually the 90% that can't get, the 94% that can't get, into the 6%.
Marcee is going to do the call to action this week. Okay, what are the 3 things to try out for all of their kids, whether they're neurodiverse or not? These are the 3 keys.
Essentially, the 3 keys are: figure out how they like to consume information. So this is kind of learning style. This is offering more than one format. It's not just lectures or not just books all the time. Then figure out how they like to interact with that material, how they like to create with that material, and offering them many ways to do that, whether it's a video or visual or just traditional is fine too. And as you're doing that, you're figuring out their learning style. So as you do those 2 things, you'll figure out their learning style. And then throughout the process, you're going to involve them, and you're going to key into their agency and help them, let them choose, let them have some skin in the game, and figure out how, as a team, you want to mark their improvement, measure their improvement, and how you want to set goals. So those 3 things, with the eye of focusing on their strengths, is kind of this magic little recipe for any child to learn very well, but particularly neurodivergent children.
Awesome. So give those a go, and then write down in the comment section below, how did it go? Like, how did that go for you when you tried it out? What did you think about this video? If you like our videos, don't forget to like and subscribe, and give us more questions if you have any more questions or topics that you would like for us to cover. And big thank you to Marcee You will most likely see her again. You can see how amazing she is. Thank you so much.
Thank
Marcee.
you.
So she will be back, I'm sure. So thank you again for coming this week, and thanks, Marcee. We'll see you
Thanks for
next
having
week.
me.
Oh yeah.
Sure love you guys. Thanks.
See you next week.
Bye.